Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, please leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is when you are listening to this. We want to know where these documented accounts go and when they get there. In the winter of 1912, the Springfield Republican newspaper printed a small notice about a family disturbance in Tenney County, deep in the Ozark Mountains. The article, which was only 3 paragraphs long, said that local police had been called to look into the disappearance of a woman named Eliza Whitlock from her remote home near the White River. The paper said that her husband, Thomas Whitlock, said she left on her own after an argument at home. The article ended by saying that no more investigation was needed at that time. The newspaper didn't say that this short article would be the start of one of the most disturbing cases in Ozark history, one that would go mostly unreported for decades. The Whitlock property was on about 40 acres of rocky hillside near the small town of Walnut Shade, which is about 15 miles south of Forsyth, the county seat of Tenney County. The homestead had a 2-story wooden house, a small barn, and a few other buildings. County records from 1908 show that Thomas Whitlock bought the property after moving from Springfield, where he had worked as a clerk at the Hears department store. These records say that Thomas was a quiet man with certain habits. Before they got married in 1905, his wife, Eliza, who used to be Eliza Crawford, was a teacher in Christian County. Edward was 6 years old in 1912, and Mary was 4. People in the neighborhood remembered the Whitlocks as a private family who didn't often take part in community events. Thomas would sometimes go to Forsyth or Branson to get supplies, but after their first year of living there, Eliza was hardly ever seen outside of their property. It wasn't unusual for the area to be so isolated. Homesteads could be miles apart and separated by thick oak and pine forests, limestone bluffs, and steep hollows. People have been going to the Ozarks for a long time to get away from the law, their debts, or just society in general. Joseph Miller, whose family owned the property to the east, said that the Whitlocks seemed happy enough during their first few years on the homestead. In 1952, a researcher from the Missouri Historical Society talked to Miller about Thomas. He remembered that Thomas was very particular about the boundaries of his land and mostly kept to himself, but he would nod hello when they met. Miller said that Thomas started making improvements to the property in the fall of 1911, about 6 months before Eliza went missing. He dug what looked like a new root cellar behind the house and added more locks to the doors. The last time anyone outside of Eliza Whitlock's immediate family saw her was in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, went to the homestead after hearing that Eliza was sick. Bowman told the Tenney County Sheriff in April 1912 that she found Eliza pale, distant, and nervous, but she didn't seem to be sick. Bowman said that the house was unusually cold even though the fireplace was on, and Thomas stayed in the room the whole time she was there, answering most of the questions directed at his wife. When Bowman suggested that Eliza might benefit from a visit to the doctor in Forsyth, Thomas reportedly said that the family couldn't afford it and that his wife would get better with rest. County records show that Thomas Whitlock had been taking money out of the family's small savings account at the Tenney County Bank on a regular basis during the fall of 1911. According to bank records kept in the county archives, Thomas took out almost half of the family's savings between September and December of that year. Harold Winters, the bank manager, later said that Thomas had said that these withdrawals were needed for home repairs and getting ready for winter. Winters said that these kinds of expenses weren't unusual for homesteaders getting ready for the winter in the Ozarks, but the amount seemed too high for a family like the Whitlocks. The Ozarks had a very bad winter in 1911-1912. Heavy snow in December and January cut off many remote homes for weeks at a time. Families often didn't have any contact with the outside world until early spring. The Springfield Weather Bureau's records show that temperatures in February 1912 dropped to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit several times, and there were several inches of snow on the ground until mid-March. Because of the bad weather, people could do strange things without their neighbors noticing for a long time. Eliza Whitlock is said to have left her family during this time of isolation, which was sometime between late February and early March 1912. It was never clear when she went missing. In late March, Thomas Whitlock told Joseph Miller about his wife's absence for the first time when Miller saw him on the way to Forsyth. Miller's 1,952 account says that Thomas only said, "The missus has gone away," and didn't explain why. Miller didn't ask any more questions because he was used to his neighbors being private. Records from the general store in Forsyth show that Thomas Whitlock's buying habits changed a lot in early March 1912. Store records show that on March 4th, he bought an unusually large amount of preserved foods, coffee, and lamp oil. This was enough to keep a family going for several weeks without needing to go back to town. Jeremiah Collins, the store owner, wrote in his personal journal, which was found among his papers after he died in 1938, that Thomas seemed upset and didn't want to make small talk during this visit. Collins wrote that he asked Thomas about Mrs. Whitlock's health, and Thomas replied in a short way, "She is not my concern at present." If it weren't for Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, who lived in Springfield and hadn't heard from Eliza since the fall, the whole thing might have stayed private. Letters kept in the Tenney County Historical Society archives show that Catherine wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade in early April 1912 to ask about her sister's health. When the postmaster told her that Eliza had left her family, Catherine went to Tenney County and asked Sheriff James Harmon to look into the case. Catherine Crawford's granddaughter gave her personal journal to the Missouri State Archives in 1961. It shows how worried she was about her sister's situation. Catherine wrote on the 10th of April 1912, "I can't believe Eliza would leave her children willingly." Since her marriage to Thomas, her letters had become less frequent and more guarded, but every word she wrote about Edward and Mary showed how much she cared about them. "Something is terribly wrong, and I fear what I might find in Tenney County." Sheriff Harmon's official report from the 18th of April 1912 talks about his trip to the Whitlock homestead. Harmon said that the property was in good shape and that Thomas and both kids were there. Harmon said that the kids looked well fed and dressed, but they were both very quiet during his visit. Thomas said that Eliza had left on her own after saying she was unhappy with their isolated life. She took only a small bag with her personal things. He said he didn't know where she was going, but he thought she might have gone back to her family in Springfield. Catherine kept saying that her sister hadn't called any family members, but Harmon's report includes a short description of his inspection of the house, which showed no signs of trouble or struggle. He said that Eliza's clothes and other things seemed to be missing from the bedroom drawers, which backed up Thomas's story that she had packed before she left. The sheriff decided that there wasn't enough proof of foul play, and that Eliza, as an adult, had the right to leave her family if she wanted to. The official investigation came to an end when Catherine Crawford reluctantly agreed with this conclusion. Harmon's report didn't mention it, but his personal papers that were found after his death in 1931 showed that he had seen some worrying things while visiting the Whitlock property. In a private notebook, Harmon wrote, "Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned. The children watched their father's face before answering any question, no matter how innocuous. The boy began to speak about his mother, but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most troubling was the fresh-turned earth behind the house, which Whitlock claimed was a garden plot, though it was an odd time for planting and shaped more like a trench than a garden bed." This private note from Harmon suggests that he had doubts about Thomas Whitlock, but didn't have enough proof to act on them. The sheriff wrote, "There is no crime to investigate without a body or a witness. Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, do not prove anything. In these hills, family matters are generally considered private, and the county does not have the resources for long investigations based on mere suspicion. This reluctance to act without hard evidence was typical of law enforcement and cultural attitudes in rural Missouri in the early 20th century. Catherine Crawford went back to Springfield after meeting with Sheriff Harmon, but she was still worried about what would happen to her sister. Her journal says that she tried to stay in touch with her niece and nephew by sending them letters and small gifts, but Thomas only sent her short, formal responses. In June 1912, she went back to Tenney County to see the kids again, but Thomas turned her away, saying that her presence was making things difficult for the family. Catherine's last journal entry about the issue, dated the 3rd of July 1912, says, "I fear I have failed Eliza. I can't get into Thomas's house or take the kids without proof or legal standing. All I can do is pray that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she will find her way back to them. Or at least to me. The disappearance of Eliza Whitlock was a private matter for a few years, known only to her close family and a few locals. Thomas kept running the homestead and raising his children with some help from a local woman named Martha Jenkins, who came over a few times a week to help with chores. Jenkins, who started working at the Whitlock home in the summer of 1912, later told a neighbor that Thomas had told her not to talk to the kids about Eliza and to tell them that their mother would come back when she was better. Sheriff Masterson talked to Jenkins for a short time during the 1952 investigation. At that time, she was an old woman living in a nursing home in Branson. She remembered a few strange things about her job at the Whitlock home. The county archives have a copy of the interview transcript, which says that Jenkins said that Thomas had made strict rules about which parts of the property should not be used. He wouldn't let anyone near the root cellar he had built, she said. Once, when young Mary wandered toward it, Thomas grabbed her so roughly that she cried out. He later apologized, saying there were dangerous tools stored there that might harm the children. Jenkins also reported that Thomas frequently suffered from insomnia and would pace the house at night. She found him sitting at the kitchen table several times in the morning, apparently having been awake all night, mumbling about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Jenkins said that these behaviors worried her, but she thought they were caused by the stress of raising 2 kids on her own. Like a lot of people in the area, she didn't want to get involved in what she thought were private family matters. In 1913, Edward and Mary Whitlock started going to the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade. Abigail Thornton, their teacher, wrote in her personal diary that both kids were unusually withdrawn and that Edward in particular had a worrying habit of staying quiet for long periods of time. In October 1913, Thornton wrote about an event in which a woman who came to the school tried to talk to Mary about her mother. Thornton says that Mary became upset, and later that day Thomas Whitlock came to the school, took both children home, and kept them there for almost 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, which was kept private until it was given to the Tenney County Historical Society in 1965, has a lot of other things to say about the Whitlock kids. She said that Edward often came to school with dark circles under his eyes, and that the noises kept him awake at night. When asked what noises he meant, the boy wouldn't say. Mary, who was younger, seemed to adjust to school life better, but she had what Thornton called an unusual obsession with burial. The teacher wrote down that she found a number of drawings in Mary's desk that showed what looked like a person lying underground with flowers growing above them. Thornton's diary says that Edward Whitlock's behavior got worse and worse in the spring of 1914. He started having what the teacher called episodes, which were times when he would stop responding and stare blankly at nothing. After one of these episodes, when Edward kept whispering, "She's still digging," Thornton tried to talk to Thomas about the boy's health. Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger. He told me that his son's education was his business and that my observations were not welcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do? Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter. The Whitlock family lived in isolation until 1917, when Thomas suddenly sold the farm and moved with the kids to Kansas City. County records show that James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, bought the property for much less than what it was worth. Harker later told neighbors that Thomas seemed eager to finish the sale quickly and had taken the first offer he received. The Whitlock family left at a time when local authorities were paying more attention to them. During the investigation in 1952, records from the Tenney County School Board showed that Abigail Thornton had finally told the county superintendent about her worries about the Whitlock children in March 1917. After that, the superintendent started an investigation by writing to Thomas and asking for a meeting to talk about the children's well-being. The post office says that this letter was delivered on the 3rd of April 1917. The next day, Thomas put the property up for sale, and by the end of the month, he had sold it. James Harker bought the Whitlock property and made a number of changes to the house, such as tearing down the last bits of the root cellar that were behind it. William Harker, Harker's son, told investigators in 1952 that his father had called the cellar weird because it was deeper than necessary for storing produce and divided into sections by interior walls. William Harker also said that His father had found a woman's hairbrush with dark hairs still stuck in the bristles, buried about 2 feet below the cellar floor during the demolition. William said that his father didn't think much of the discovery at the time because he thought it was just trash from the house. The Harker family owned the old Whitlock property until 1933, when they had to sell it because they were having financial problems during the Great Depression. Over the next 20 years, the homestead changed hands several times. As the original buildings got older and new residents focused on other parts of the property, it slowly fell into disrepair. By 1950, the house was mostly empty, but local teens would sometimes use it as a meeting place. This led to rumors that a crying woman lived there and could be heard on quiet nights. For the next few decades, people in the area forgot about Eliza Whitlock's disappearance. The family's move away from the area, along with the chaos of World War I and the flu epidemic that followed, pushed the unresolved issue out of the public eye. It might have stayed there forever if it hadn't been for a discovery made in 1952. That year, Walter and Ruth Simmons, from Street, Louis bought the old Whitlock property, which had been abandoned and overgrown, with plans to turn it into a hunting lodge. A report filed with the Tenney County Sheriff's Department on the 12th of June, 1952, said that the Simmons were clearing brush behind the falling down house when they found what looked like the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar or storage space. They found a small leather-bound book stuck between 2 of the limestone blocks that made up the cellar's foundation when they looked more closely. It was clear that the book had been damaged by water and time. It was a personal diary belonging to Eliza Whitlock, with entries from January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons, who found the diary first, later told the Springfield News Leader about her first thoughts on the book. The pages were stuck together and a lot of the ink had run, but you could still read the writing in some places. What struck me right away was how the writer's handwriting changed over time. The early entries were neat and controlled, but the later ones got more and more messy, as if they were written by someone who was scared or angry. Sheriff William Masterson started looking into the case again after finding the diary. The diary's contents, which were only partially readable because of the damage, told a disturbing story about the last years of Eliza Whitlock's life. At first, the entries were about everyday things that happened in the country. Over time, they changed to show how worried Eliza was getting about her husband's behavior. She wrote on the 14th of August, 1911, "T.E. watches all the time. He says the house isn't safe enough and talks about dangers I can't see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I can't describe." On the 3rd of October 1911, she wrote, "The children are not allowed to go beyond the yard now. T.E. has nailed shut the window in our bedroom. He says it's to keep out the cold, but the first frost hasn't even come." The most troubling entries in the diary started in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman came to visit. Eliza wrote, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there, listening to every word. When she left, T. said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she recorded, "The new room beneath the house is nearly completed. T. works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He speaks of it as a sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb." A particularly disturbing entry dated January 8, 1912 reads, "I found Edward this morning, standing at the entrance to the cellar, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'Father says we'll all sleep there soon, when the time comes.' When I questioned T.E. about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. He did not leave my side for the remainder of the day." Eliza's entries got shorter and more broken up as January went on. On January 23rd, she wrote, "Tonic. He prepares each evening. It leaves me groggy and confused the next day. I began pouring it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days." Another entry dated February 2nd simply states, "I must get the children away from here. But how? The snow is deep, and we are miles from town. T.E. has hidden my boots and coat. He says it is to prevent me from falling ill, but I know the truth." The final readable entry dated February 17, 1912, contained just 3 lines. He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again. Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the area where the root cellar had been after reading the diary. On the 18th of June, 1952, investigators found human remains that were later identified as those of Eliza Whitlock using dental records. A medical exam showed that she had been hit in the head with something hard before she was buried. The way the body was found suggested that she had been buried face down in a shallow grave, with her hands tied behind her back with wire. In his report, Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the medical examiner who did the autopsy on Eliza's body, mentioned a few more things. Wilson figured out that Eliza was about 32 years old when she died, which is in line with what is known about her age. He also found proof that she had broken her left wrist before she died, and that it had healed. This injury is not mentioned in any known records. Most importantly, Wilson found signs of a sedative in the preserved tissue samples, which means that Eliza may have been drugged before she died. This discovery backed up what she had written in her diary about the tonic that Thomas had made her take. After the discovery, the police tried to find Thomas Whitlock and his kids, but the investigation showed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from complications from pneumonia. In 1944, during World War II, Edward Whitlock was killed in action. Mary Coleman, who was then Mary Whitlock, was the only one still alive. She lived in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and 3 kids. The investigation looked at records from the Kansas City Public Library, which gave some information about the Whitlock family's life after they left Tenney County. City directories showed that Thomas had been a night watchman at a warehouse from 1917 to 1928 when he had to retire because of health problems. Edward went to school until the 8th grade, and then he got a job at the same warehouse. Investigators found neighbors from that time who said Thomas was a strict father who kept to himself but wasn't very different from other people. Estelle Parker, a former neighbor, said that Thomas never talked about his wife who had passed away and got angry if anyone asked about the children's mother. Mary Whitlock married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, in 1929 and soon after moved to Omaha. According to marriage records, she said her mother was dead on the application, but there was no death certificate for Eliza at the time. This made it seem like either Thomas had told his daughter that her mother had died, or Mary had chosen to act like her mother was dead. Mary Coleman told Missouri police in July 1952 that she didn't remember anything about the events leading up to her mother's disappearance. She said that her father had always told her that her mother had left the family and that she had no reason to doubt this. Coleman's husband later contacted investigators privately and said that his wife had nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards and had always been very afraid of small spaces. Richard Coleman told the police more about how his wife was feeling mentally. He wrote in a letter that is still in the case file, "Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage." These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, particularly the sound of digging or scraping, or by the sight of certain objects, including gardening tools and root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I asked about the origin of these fears, she would become distant and change the subject. Interviews with people who used to live in Tenney County and knew the Whitlock family revealed more information to the investigation. Clara Jensen, who was a little girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912, remembered that her father had once seen Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth buying a lot of quicklime from the hardware store. When asked about the purchase, Thomas said it was to keep the walls of the root cellar from getting wet. Jensen also remembered hearing her parents talk about strange noises coming from the Whitlock property late at night that winter. Her father said these noises were caused by wild animals or the wind blowing through the hollow. Jensen's brother, Harold, wrote down what happened when he met Edward Whitlock in the spring of 1912. This statement says that Harold had seen Edward close to the property line that separated their family's lands. The Whitlock boy looked upset and asked Harold if people could hear things through the ground. Edward said, "Father says no one can hear anything through the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Harold was about to ask more questions when Thomas Whitlock showed up and told his son to come home. Harold told his parents about the weird talk but they thought it was just his childish imagination. More research into Thomas Whitlock's past may have found a reason for his growing paranoia in the months leading up to Eliza's disappearance. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, which is now called the Nevada State Hospital, show that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, was put in the hospital in 1890 after having violent, paranoid delusions. Some reports say that the older Whitlock thought his wife was working with their neighbors to hurt him and tried to lock her up in their house. According to hospital records, William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902. The notes said that he had a family history of paranoid thoughts. There was also a letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, to the hospital director in 1,895 inches the asylum records. In this letter, she said she was worried about her son's nervousness and asked if her husband's illness could be passed on to their children. The director's response, which is also in the file, told Sarah that mental aberrations are not necessarily inherited. However, they also told her that Thomas should be guided toward jobs that don't cause too much stress or isolation. This suggests that some family history of mental illness was already known. The new owners of the old Whitlock property invited Professor Alan Matthews, a historian studying Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, to visit in October 1952. Matthews wrote down the layout of the homestead and where Eliza's body was found. The university archives have his notes, which talk about how the property is isolated. The homestead is in a narrow valley and is surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes. Even at noon, some parts of the yard are still in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house is less than a mile away as the crow flies, but you can't see it from the Whitlock property because of the hills in between. You could scream here, and no one would hear you beyond these hills. Matthews also wrote down what people in the area believed about the property after the Whitlocks left. Some people who live in Walnut Shade said they stay away from the area because they heard a woman crying or the sound of digging at night when they passed by the abandoned homestead. Matthews said that stories like this were common for many abandoned properties in the Ozarks. However, he thought that in this case, they might have come from real sounds that people heard while walking by in the winter of 1911 to 1912. Matthews wrote in his field journal, "The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual. Standing at the former site of the root cellar, I conducted a simple experiment, dropping stones into the remaining depression and noting how the sound carried. Even a small impact produces an echo that reverberates between the limestone bluffs. It occurs to me that if someone were digging in this location at night, when ambient noise is reduced, the sound might indeed travel considerable distances, creating the impression of ghostly activity to those unfamiliar with the terrain." In December 1952, the case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed. Thomas Whitlock was found guilty of killing her. Her body was buried in the Springfield Cemetery next to her parents' and sisters' graves. The story got a little bit of attention in local papers, but it was soon overshadowed by bigger national news. The Tenney County Historical Society has a small file on the case that includes copies of the original sheriff's reports, excerpts from Eliza's diary, and newspaper articles about the 1952 discovery. One of these documents is a transcript of an interview with Richard Anderson, who was James Harmon's deputy sheriff in 1912. Anderson, who was in his late 72nd at the time of the 1952 investigation, remembered that Sheriff Harmon was still upset about the Whitlock case long after the official investigation was over. Anderson said that Harmon had brought up the case a few times over the years, once saying, "Sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait." Anderson thought that Harmon had thought something was wrong, but didn't have the proof or resources to take the case any further. The last big thing to happen in the Whitlock case happened in 1968 when Mary Coleman's oldest son, Robert, called the Tenney County Historical Society to ask about his grandparents. Robert had recently found his mother's collection of childhood drawings, which had been hidden in their attic after she died of cancer earlier that year, according to letters in the Society's archives. Mary made the drawings when she was between 5 and 8 years old. They showed a small girl under what looked like floorboards or ground, with stick figures standing above her. One drawing, which a child wrote "Mama sleeping on," showed a similar scene with what looked like a man digging. A psychologist named Dr. Eleanor Mitchell looked at the drawings at the request of the Historical Society, and wrote an analysis that is now part of the case file. Mitchell said that the drawings showed many signs of trauma in children, such as repeating disturbing themes, using a lot of pressure to draw certain parts, especially the lines that show the ground or floor, and putting figures in tight or buried positions. Mitchell said, "These drawings strongly suggest that the child who made them saw or knew about a very disturbing event involving the burial of a female figure, probably her mother." The fact that the images are the same in several drawings shows that this was not just a passing fantasy, but a memory or preoccupation that lasted. In the summer of 1968, Robert Coleman went to the old Whitlock property. By that time, the original house had been torn down and replaced with a hunting lodge. After his visit, he wrote to the Historical Society, "Standing on that ground, I felt a deep sadness, not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother who carried this buried truth her whole life. Some secrets refuse to stay hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried." Coleman went on to say that his mother was a loving parent, but always seemed distant, as if part of her was still locked in that valley in the Ozarks. He said that Mary had refused to talk about her childhood and had acted strangely anxious when her kids asked about their grandparents. Coleman wrote, "Now I get it. She was protecting us from a truth she couldn't fully face, that her father, the man who raised her, killed her mother and made her stay silent for the rest of her life." The Whitlock case is an example of something that criminologists would later find in many rural areas: how being alone and private can let domestic violence get worse without anyone stepping in. In the early 1900s Ozarks, where homesteads were far apart and cultural norms discouraged people from getting involved in family matters, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had few ways to get away when her husband's mental health got worse. The closest neighbor lived miles away, and the weather in the winter made it hard to get around. Even when people like midwife Harriet Bowman or teacher Abigail Thornton raised concerns, it was unlikely that local authorities would be able to help because they didn't have enough resources or power. Professor Matthews wrote about the Whitlock case in a 1954 paper for the Journal of Ozark Studies to show how it fit into larger patterns of crime and community response in rural areas. He said that Thomas Whitlock's position as the male head of the household gave him almost complete control over his family in the eyes of the community. People who lived nearby might have seen warning signs, but they didn't want to get involved because they believed that a man's home is his castle. Matthews contended that the amalgamation of physical seclusion and cultural detachment fostered an environment conducive to family violence, characterized by a diminished likelihood of detection or repercussions. The psychological effects on the Whitlock children constitute an additional aspect of the case that has garnered academic interest. Dr. Mitchell, in her examination of Mary's drawings, posited that the young girl had formulated a sophisticated coping mechanism to address the trauma she had experienced. Mitchell wrote, "Mary seems to have compartmentalized the experience, creating a psychological barrier between her conscious awareness and the truth she knew at some level. This is a common response to childhood trauma that lets the person function, but at the cost of full psychological barrier. Integration. The old Whitlock property is now part of a bigger park. Not many people who come here know the history of that piece of land, or the sad things that happened there. The limestone bluffs still cast long shadows over the valley. Some people say that when the wind blows through the hollow at dusk, it carries echoes of the past, sounds that could be mistaken for a woman's distant voice calling from somewhere below the ground. Not only is the way Eliza Whitlock died disturbing, but the fact that no one spoke up about it for so long is also disturbing. People in the early 1900s, Ozarks lived in small, isolated communities where privacy was very important, and people generally stayed out of family affairs. Because of this cultural tendency not to get involved, it was easy for someone to disappear without much questioning. The diary discovered in 1952 is our sole insight into Eliza's experiences during her final months. Her escalating fear as her husband's mental health declined, her worries for her children's safety, and her deepening isolation from the external world. The entries show that the woman knew she was in danger but felt stuck by her physical situation and the social norms that didn't protect wives and mothers very well. The silence that lasted long after Eliza's death is probably the most haunting thing about it. Her kids, especially Mary, seem to have buried their memories with their mother, making it hard for them to face the truth. Mary's drawings, which were found after she died, showed that some part of her had always known what happened. The truth came out in her art, even though it was never spoken about in her life. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary humans, whose minds have turned against them and against those they once loved. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary people whose minds have turned against them and against those they once loved. For those who study these kinds of things, the Whitlock tragedy shows how being alone can make mental illness worse, how cultural norms can allow abuse, and how the truth always comes out, no matter how well it is hidden. Since the discovery of Eliza's remains, forensic psychology has created tools that could have helped find Thomas Whitlock's mental health problems before they led to violence. Laws have also changed to better protect potential victims, but similar things keep happening in remote areas where privacy can still protect the unthinkable. The limestone soil of the Ozarks eventually revealed what Thomas Whitlock tried to hide. For 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in her unmarked grave, her fate known only to the man who put her there and maybe the children who carried the burden of that knowledge in their nightmares and silence. That silence is what makes the Whitlock case so scary. It spoke volumes to those who were willing to listen. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist who looked over the case files in 1960 for an article in the American Journal of Haute Psychiatry, said that Thomas Whitlock probably had paranoid schizophrenia, which is what his father had. Hirsch observed that the onset of Thomas's symptoms conformed to the typical progression of the disorder, commencing in his late 22nd or early 32nd, and progressively intensifying. His paranoia got worse over time, starting with general distrust of his neighbors and ending with the belief that his wife was somehow contaminated or dangerous. This is in line with what has been seen in cases of untreated psychosis. Hirsch said, "What sets the Whitlock case apart from many other similar tragedies is the long time that Thomas kept up the appearance of normalcy after getting rid of the perceived threat. Most familicide cases end with the perpetrator's suicide or immediate arrest." Hirsch also said, Whitlock's ability to create and maintain an alternative narrative that his wife had left the family and to function in society for almost 2 decades afterward suggests a complicated relationship between his delusions and his crass awareness of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and make up a plausible cover story, which shows that some part of him knew that what he had done would be condemned by others. Psychologists studying the case have been especially interested in how the kids reacted to the trauma they saw or sensed. Edward Whitlock's school records, which were found during the 1952 investigation, show that after his mother went missing, his grades got worse and his behavior got worse. His teacher saw him have what we now call dissociative episodes, when he stopped responding or seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear. These symptoms indicate that Edward may have developed what contemporary clinicians would diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary Whitlock's answer was very different from her brother's. Edward showed more clear signs of distress, but Mary seemed to adjust to their new situation more easily. Dr. Mitchell said that Mary's age at the time of the trauma might have made it easier for her to separate her experiences. Mitchell wrote in her analysis, "Children of 3 to 4 years old are still developing their understanding of permanence and causality. Mary may have been better able to accept the story her father told because her brain was still best developing. But as her drawings show, the truth was still in her unconscious mind, coming out through her art in ways she couldn't put into words." Mary's adult life is more proof of how childhood trauma can affect someone for a long time. Her husband told investigators that she showed many of the same signs that adults who have been through trauma as children do: chronic anxiety, specific phobias related to the traumatic event, especially her fear of small spaces, an aversion to digging sounds, and emotional detachment. Richard Coleman said that his wife was loving but somehow not there, as if a part of her was somewhere else. This division of consciousness, the capacity to operate normally in various facets of life while isolating traumatic memories, is an acknowledged survival mechanism in trauma psychology. Robert Coleman's description of his mother's parenting style in his letters to the Historical Society suggests that the trauma has affected more than one generation. He said that Mary was very protective of her kids, so much so that it caused problems with his father. He wrote, "She would get unreasonably anxious if we were out of her sight for even a little while. And she had strict rules about certain activities. For example, we could never play in the basement or dig holes in the yard deeper than a certain depth. At the time, these seemed like random rules, but now I see that they were related to her own buried experiences." The way the community reacted to the Whitlock case is similar to how people in rural America in the early 20th century thought about family violence and mental illness. When Sheriff Harmon looked into Eliza's disappearance in 1912, he was working within a legal and cultural framework that valued family privacy and male authority. People thought that domestic violence was a private issue, not a crime that needed to be stopped by the police. Harmon had little reason to continue the investigation, even though he personally suspected foul play, because there was no clear proof of it, and Thomas had a good reason for his wife's absence. The neighbors who saw Thomas's behavior change in worrying ways, he was becoming more isolated, making strange changes to his property, and acting agitated in town, also saw these signs through the lens of their time. People didn't know much about mental illness, and it was often blamed on moral weakness or spiritual failings instead of medical conditions that needed treatment. People might have raised their eyebrows when a family left the community, but it wasn't seen as a reason to step in, especially in the Ozarks where independence and self-sufficiency were important cultural values. Catherine Crawford and others who were very close to the situation had a lot of trouble taking effective action. Catherine, Eliza's sister, had no legal right to demand to see her niece and nephew, or to force a more thorough investigation into her sister's disappearance. She wrote in her journal that she was unhappy with the limits of her job. The law would be more interested if Eliza were just a missing person, but a woman who might have chosen to leave is within her rights, no matter how strange that would be. Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist who studied rural homicide patterns in 1980 and included the Whitlock case, said that the fact that the Ozark communities were so isolated made them perfect for what she called invisible crimes, acts of violence that go unnoticed because of geographic and cultural factors. Foster wrote, "In urban settings, disappearances are more likely to be noticed and questioned. Multiple social connections create a network that makes complete erasure difficult. But in places like the Ozarks in the early 20th century, a person could effectively vanish with little social disruption, especially women whose social identities were often defined primarily through their husbands." Foster argued that the 40-year delay in discovering Eliza's fate was not simply a failure of investigation, but a systemic blindness to certain forms of violence. She wrote, "The story Thomas Whitlock made up that his wife had left her family was easily believed because it fit with other stories about how unreliable women are and how hard life on the frontier is. The other explanation, that a husband killed his wife, was both more disturbing and harder to deal with in the legal and social systems that were already in place. It was easier for everyone to accept the story of abandonment. The Ozarks' key physical features made it easy for the crime to happen and for the criminals to hide it. People have been able to hide from view in the rough terrain, which has deep hollows, dense forests, and limestone caves. These same traits made the area perfect for moonshining during Prohibition. The Whitlock case shows that the homestead's remote location, in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hillsides, made it easy for strange things to happen without anyone noticing. The bitterly cold and snowy winter of 1911 to 1912 made it even less likely that unexpected guests would show up and see bad behavior. Professor Matthews, in his research on the property, found that the area's limestone-rich soil had unintentionally kept evidence that might have otherwise been lost. The soil's alkaline nature and the root cellar's relatively dry conditions helped keep both the diary and, to some extent, Eliza's remains safe. He wrote, "In more acidic soils or in places with more moisture, decomposition would have been more complete, possibly making it impossible to identify the body decades later. This preservation of evidence allowed the truth to finally come out, bringing some closure to a case that might have stayed a missing person case. Walter and Ruth Simmons found Eliza's diary in 1952, which led to an investigation that finally found out what had happened on that remote homestead 40 years earlier.